Sometimes, the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected packages. When your heart has grown cold from years of protecting what you've built, it takes strangers to remind you what truly matters. Weston Cole was a wealthy rancher who had everything money could buy, but had forgotten the value of human kindness. One bitter winter night, he found an elderly couple freezing outside his ranch. Most people would have turned them away, but something stirred in Weston's heart. He brought them inside, gave them food and shelter. For days, the old couple said very little. But as the snow continued to fall, Weston began to notice something special about these strangers. What they carried with them wasn't gold or riches, but something far more valuable. What did this mysterious couple possess that would change Weston's life forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had been howling across the high plains of Larkspur County for 3 days straight, carrying with it the kind of cold that settled deep in a man's bones and refused to let go. From the warmth of his study, Weston Cole watched the snow pile against the windows of his ranch house, each flake adding to the growing wall that would soon make travel impossible for anyone foolish enough to venture out. At 58, Weston had learned to read the signs of a hard winter, and this one promised to be among the worst he'd seen. The cattle had been moved to the lower pastures weeks ago, the hay stores were full, and every piece of equipment had been serviced and stored. His ranch, the Double Diamond, sprawled across 15,000 acres of some of the finest grazing land in Montana, and every inch of it bore the mark of careful planning and relentless hard work. The house itself stood as testament to what a man could build when he put his mind to it. 3 stories of native stone and timber, with windows that stretched from floor to ceiling, and a great room large enough to host the entire town if needed. Persian rugs covered floors of polished oak, and the walls displayed artwork that museums would envy. A fortune in comfort and beauty, all of it arranged with the precision of a man who understood that details mattered. Yet for all its grandeur, the house felt hollow tonight, its rooms too large and too quiet for one man alone. Weston's fingers absently turned the silver dollar he always carried in his pocket, a habit formed over 4 decades of holding on to the last gift his father had given him. The coin bore the scratches and wear of constant handling, its edges smooth from years of worry and remembrance. His father, Samuel Cole, not the grandfather he'd discovered tonight, but the man who'd raised him, had pressed that dollar into 8-year-old Weston's palm the morning he died, telling him it would bring him luck as long as he remembered where he came from. The irony wasn't lost on him now. He'd built an empire, accumulated wealth beyond his father's wildest dreams, but somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten everything else that mattered. The sound of boots on the wooden porch broke through his reverie, followed by the familiar knock of Jake Morrison, his foreman, and the closest thing to family he had left. Jake had worked the Double Diamond for 23 years. Since the day Weston bought the first 1,000 acres with money he'd scraped together from years of working other men's ranches. Where Weston was tall and lean, Jake was built like a tree stump, wide, solid, and seemingly immovable. His weathered face bore the marks of a lifetime spent outdoors, and his grey eyes held the kind of wisdom that came only from experience. "Come in, before you freeze to that porch," Weston called, not turning from the window. Jake stamped the snow from his boots and hung his hat on the peg by the door. "Cattle are settled for the night. Got the hands bunked down in the bunkhouse with enough supplies to last the week if this storm keeps up." He paused, studying his boss's reflection in the dark glass. "You all right, Weston? You've been standing at that window for near an hour." "Just thinking," Weston replied, finally turning away from the storm. "This weather reminds me of the winter my father died. Same kind of cold, same endless wind." Jake had heard fragments of Weston's story over the years, but his boss wasn't a man given to sharing much about his past. What he knew was that Weston had grown up poor, worked his way up from nothing, and somewhere along the way had lost everyone who mattered to him. The details remained locked away, guarded as carefully as the contents of the safe upstairs. "Martha's got coffee on if you want some," Jake offered. "She's worried about you eating, says you've been picking at your food for days." Martha Henley had been cooking for the Double Diamond since the second year Weston owned it. She was a woman of indeterminate age, somewhere between 50 and 70, depending on the light, with steel-grey hair she wore, pulled back in a practical bun, and hands that could work magic with the simplest ingredients. She'd outlasted 3 other cooks, not through any great culinary skill, though she was competent enough, but because she understood that Weston needed someone who wouldn't pry into his business or try to mother him. She fed him, kept house, and minded her own affairs, which suited them both perfectly. "Tell Martha, I'll eat when I'm hungry," Weston said, though they both knew he'd been saying the same thing for months. Food had become fuel, nothing more, another necessity to be managed rather than enjoyed. Jake nodded and started toward the kitchen, then stopped. Almost forgot. Billy found something odd out by the north fence line today when he was checking the cattle. Tracks in the snow looked like 2 people walking. Fresh tracks, made since the snow started falling. "Probably just neighbors checking their own stock," Weston said, but something in Jake's tone suggested there was more to it. "That's what I thought," but Billy followed them for a ways. Tracks were heading toward the ranch, not away from it, and whoever made them was struggling. One set was deeper than the other, like someone was supporting someone else. Blood in the snow, too. Not much, but enough to notice. Weston felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. In this country, people didn't travel on foot in weather like this unless they had no other choice. And if someone was bleeding, they were in serious trouble. "How far from the house?" he asked. "Maybe a quarter-mile." Billy lost the tracks where the wind had blown the snow around, but they were definitely heading this way. Before Weston could respond, a sound cut through the howling wind, 3 sharp knocks on the front door. Both men froze, eyes meeting in the kind of silent communication that comes from years of working together. Visitors didn't come calling during blizzards, not unless something was desperately wrong. The knocking came again, weaker this time, more of a scratching than a proper knock. Weston moved toward the door, Jake falling in beside him. Through the frosted glass panels, they could make out 2 dark shapes huddled against the storm. Weston's hand instinctively went to the Winchester he kept mounted above the doorframe, but something about the way the figures stood swaying, supporting each other, told him these weren't the kind of visitors who came looking for trouble. He opened the door and felt the full force of the wind drive snow across the threshold. On his porch stood an elderly couple, their clothes so covered with ice and snow they looked like sculptures left too long in winter. The man was tall but stooped, his arm around a woman who seemed barely able to stand. Both of them looked up at Weston with eyes that held more gratitude than hope, as if they'd already accepted their fate but were thankful for this last moment of human contact. "Please," the old man said, his voice barely audible above the wind. "We're not looking for charity, but if we could just warm ourselves by your fire for a few minutes." He didn't finish the sentence. The woman sagged against him, and Weston could see that her lips were blue with cold, her breathing shallow and rapid. These people were dying on his doorstep, and they both knew it. Every instinct Weston had developed over 40 years of protecting what was his told him to be cautious. Strangers meant trouble, especially strangers who appeared out of blizzards with stories about just needing to warm up. But something else stirred in him as he looked at the couple, something he'd thought was long dead. "Jake, help me get them inside," he said, stepping out into the storm. Together, they half-carried the couple into the great room, where the UT's massive stone fireplace threw dancing shadows across the walls. Up close, Weston could see that they were both older than he'd first thought, probably in their 70s, and they'd been walking in the storm for hours. The woman's feet were wrapped in rags that had once been shoes, and the man's coat was so worn it provided little more protection than paper. But it was what the old man clutched against his chest that caught Weston's attention, a small, worn bag that he protected even as Jake helped him out of his frozen coat. Inside that bag, barely visible through the opening, was the corner of what looked like an old book, its leather cover dark with age and handling. "Martha," Weston called, "bring blankets and hot coffee, and see if you can find some dry clothes that might fit." As the housekeeper hurried to comply, Weston knelt beside the couple, studying their faces in the firelight. There was something familiar about the old man's features, something that tugged at a memory just out of reach. But before he could pursue the thought, the woman opened her eyes and looked directly at him. "Thank you," she whispered. "We won't be any trouble, just until the storm passes." Weston nodded, but even as he covered them with Martha's blankets and pressed hot cups into their hands, he couldn't shake the feeling that trouble had already arrived. Not the kind that came with guns and harsh words, but the kind that changed everything, whether you wanted it to or not. Outside, the wind continued to howl, and the snow continued to fall, sealing all of them inside together until spring decided to return to Larkspur County. The old man's name was Samuel, and his wife was Ruth. Beyond that, they revealed little about themselves in those first few hours, speaking only when spoken to, and then, in voices so soft, Weston had to strain to hear them over the storm. They sat close together on the leather sofa nearest the fire, their hands wrapped around steaming mugs of Martha's coffee, their eyes taking in every detail of the room, with the careful attention of people who'd learned to notice everything. Martha had found clothes that more or less fit one of Weston's old flannel shirts for Samuel, and a wool dress that had belonged to the previous housekeeper for Ruth. The transformation was remarkable. Clean and dry, they revealed themselves to be people of quiet dignity, their faces marked by years of hardship, but not broken by it. Samuel's eyes were a startling blue, sharp and intelligent despite his obvious exhaustion, while Ruth possessed the kind of calm presence that seemed to settle everyone around her. "The storm should pass by tomorrow evening," Weston said, settling into his chair across from them. "You're welcome to stay until then. No sense in anyone traveling in weather like this." "That's very kind of you," Mr. Samuel began. "Cole, Weston Cole. This is my foreman, Jake Morrison, and Martha Henley keeps us all fed and civilized." Samuel nodded slowly, and Weston caught something flickering across the old man's face. Recognition, perhaps, or surprise. But it was gone so quickly he couldn't be sure. "We're grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Cole," Ruth said. "We've been walking since our truck broke down this morning. Foolish of us to travel in weather like this, but sometimes circumstances don't give you much choice." "Where were you headed?" Jake asked, and Weston noticed how Samuel's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on the worn bag he still held. "Just passing through," Samuel replied. "We don't stay anywhere very long these days." It was an evasive answer, and they all knew it. But something about the way the old man said it with weary acceptance rather than defensiveness made Weston reluctant to press for details. These people had secrets, but they didn't feel like dangerous secrets. Martha appeared with bowls of hot stew and thick slices of bread, bustling around the couple with the efficient care of someone who'd spent her life taking care of others. As Ruth thanked her for the meal, Martha paused, studying the old woman's face with a puzzled expression. "Have we met before?" Martha asked. "You look familiar somehow." Ruth smiled, but it was a careful smile. "I have one of those faces, I suppose. People are always thinking they know me from somewhere." After they'd eaten, Weston showed them to the guest room on the second floor, a comfortable space with its own fireplace and windows that looked out over the valley. Samuel moved slowly, favoring his left leg, and Weston noticed that Ruth kept a protective hand on his arm, guiding him with the practiced ease of long experience. "There are extra blankets in the wardrobe," Weston said, "and don't hesitate to call if you need anything. The storm should blow itself out by tomorrow, and then we can see about getting you where you need to go." "Thank you," Samuel said, and for a moment their eyes met. Again, Weston felt that strange sense of familiarity, as if he should know this man from somewhere. but he'd lived on the Double Diamond for 23 years, and before that he'd worked ranches across 3 states. He met a lot of people over the years. Maybe Samuel was just one of hundreds of faces that had blurred together in memory. Back downstairs, Weston found Jake and Martha waiting for him in the kitchen. Martha had made fresh coffee, and she poured 3 cups without being asked, a sure sign she had something on her mind. "Something about those 2 doesn't sit right with me," Jake said without preamble. "Not that they're dangerous, necessarily, but they're not telling us the whole truth either." "People have a right to their privacy," Weston replied, though he'd been thinking the same thing. "Privacy is one thing," Martha said, settling into her chair with the sigh of someone who'd been on her feet all day. "But that woman knew her way around this kitchen better than she should have. When I was getting the stew, she started to reach for the salt before I even mentioned where it was. Caught herself and pretended she was stretching. But I saw it. Maybe she just has good instincts about kitchens," Weston suggested, but even as he said it, he remembered how Ruth's eyes had moved around the great room, not with the wonder of someone seeing luxury for the first time, but with the careful attention of someone cataloguing details. "And another thing," Jake added. "When I mentioned the north fence line, the old man Samuel, he knew exactly what I was talking about. Didn't ask which direction or how far out. Most strangers wouldn't have any idea about the layout of the property." Weston sipped his coffee, thinking. The Double Diamond was well known in the county, and its boundaries were marked on local maps, but Jake was right. Samuel had responded as if he knew the land personally. "Maybe they're not as lost as they claim to be," he said finally. "Or maybe they're more lost than they want to admit," Martha said, and there was something in her voice that made both men look at her sharply. "What do you mean?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup as if the answers might be written in the steam. "Just a feeling," she said finally. "Sometimes people aren't just lost in terms of direction. Sometimes they're lost in life, and they're looking for something they can't quite name. Those 2 upstairs, they have the look of people who've been searching for a long time." "Searching for what?" Jake asked. "That's what worries me," Martha replied. Later, after Jake had returned to the bunkhouse and Martha had gone to her room, Weston sat alone in his study, watching the fire burn down to embers. The storm had intensified, if anything, the wind driving snow against the windows with enough force to rattle the glass. No one would be traveling anywhere tomorrow, which meant his unexpected guests would be staying at least another day. He found himself thinking about the bag Samuel had guarded so carefully, and the way Ruth had moved around the kitchen with unconscious familiarity. Most of all, he thought about that moment of recognition he'd seen in Samuel's eyes when he'd introduced himself. It nagged at him like a half-remembered song, familiar but just out of reach. Around midnight, he decided to check on his guests. The house was old, and sometimes the fireplaces in the upstairs rooms didn't draw properly, especially in wind like this. It was a reasonable excuse for what was, he had to admit, simple curiosity. The guest room was dark except for the dying glow from the fireplace, but as he approached the door, he could hear voices, Samuel and Ruth, talking in low, urgent tones. He couldn't make out the words, but there was something in their cadence that suggested they were discussing more than just their comfort for the night. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated. These people had a right to private conversation, and eavesdropping would be a poor way to repay their gratitude for his hospitality. But as he turned to leave, one word drifted clearly through the door, a name that stopped him in his tracks. Cole. They were talking about him, or his family, or something connected to the name Cole. Before he could decide what to do with that information, the voices stopped. A moment later, the door opened, and Samuel stood there in his borrowed clothes, looking directly at Weston with those sharp blue eyes. "Mr. Cole," the old man said quietly, "I thought I heard someone in the hallway. Is everything all right? I was just checking to make sure the fireplace was drawing properly," Weston replied, feeling foolish. "Sometimes the wind affects the draft." Samuel nodded. "It's drawing fine. We're very comfortable, thank you." For a moment they stood there, studying each other in the dim light of the hallway. Then Samuel reached into the bag he still carried and withdrew something, a folded piece of paper, old and yellowed with age. "Mr. Cole," he said carefully, "before you go, might I ask you something? Have you ever seen a map of this area from, say, 40 years ago? I'm trying to remember how the boundaries used to run." The question was casual enough, but something in Samuel's tone suggested it was anything but casual. Weston looked down at the paper in the old man's hands and felt his breath catch. Even in the dim light, he could see it was hand-drawn, with careful markings and notations in faded ink. "I might have something like that in my study," Weston said slowly. "Why do you ask?" Samuel smiled, but it was a sad smile, full of memory and regret. "Sometimes," he said, "the past has a way of calling us back to places we thought we'd left behind forever." With that, he stepped back into the room and closed the door, leaving Weston standing alone in the hallway with more questions than answers, and the growing certainty that his quiet winter was about to become much more complicated. 3 days passed before the storm finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. From his bedroom window, Weston could see drifts that reached nearly to the fence posts, and the familiar landmarks of his ranch had been reshaped into something almost alien. The silence was profound, no wind, no movement, except for the occasional shift of snow sliding from a tree branch. Samuel and Ruth had settled into the rhythm of the house with an ease that should have been comforting, but instead left Weston oddly unsettled. They were the kind of guests who seemed to anticipate needs before they were expressed, who appeared with offers of help just when help was most needed. Ruth had taken to assisting Martha in the kitchen without being asked, and her presence there felt so natural that Weston found himself wondering how the room had ever functioned without her quiet efficiency. Samuel, despite his obvious weariness and the limp that became more pronounced in cold weather, had appointed himself the keeper of the fires throughout the house. Weston would come downstairs each morning to find every fireplace perfectly tended, the wood stacked with military precision, and the ashes cleared away. When he mentioned it to the old man, Samuel simply smiled and said, "Old habits died hard." "I was raised to earn my keep," Samuel explained as they stood together in the great room, watching Ruth help Martha prepare lunch. "My father taught me that accepting hospitality without giving something back was just another form of theft." There was something in the way he said it that reminded Weston of his own father's teachings, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. Samuel had a way of speaking that felt familiar, as if Weston had heard those particular phrases and inflections before, in another time and place. "You don't owe us anything," Weston replied. "Anyone would have done the same thing." Samuel turned to study him with those sharp blue eyes. "Would they? In my experience, most people are quick to help when it costs them nothing. But real kindness, the kind that involves risk and sacrifice, that's rarer than folks like to believe." Before Weston could respond, Martha appeared from the kitchen, carrying a tray of coffee and what looked like a photograph tucked under her arm. She set down the tray and withdrew the picture, holding it up to the light with a puzzled expression. "Ruth found this tucked behind the flour canister when we were cleaning," Martha said. "Must have fallen back there years ago. I don't recognize the people in it, do you, Weston?" The photograph was old, probably from the 1942, judging by the clothing and the sepia tone that came from decades of exposure to light. It showed a young family, a man and woman with 2 small children, standing in front of what looked like a much smaller version of the Double Diamond ranch house. The woman held a baby while a boy of perhaps 8 or 9 stood beside his father, both of them squinting into the sun. Weston took the photograph, and the moment his fingers touched it, he felt a strange chill. Something about the boy's posture, the way he stood with one shoulder slightly higher than the other, reminded him of himself at that age. But it was the man's face that held his attention, strong features, kind eyes, and a way of holding himself that suggested confidence without arrogance. "I've never seen this before," Weston said slowly, though even as he spoke the words, something stirred in the depths of memory. The house looks like it might be the original structure, before all the additions were built. Samuel had moved closer, and when Weston glanced up, he saw the old man staring at the photograph with an expression of such profound sadness that it took his breath away. Ruth appeared beside her husband, her hand finding his arm in the automatic gesture of long marriage, and she too was looking at the picture with eyes that seemed to hold decades of grief. "Beautiful family," Ruth said quietly. "The children look happy." "They do," Martha agreed. "It's a shame we don't know who they were. I hate to think of family photographs just disappearing into forgotten corners." Samuel cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "it belongs to the original owners of this land. Old houses have a way of holding on to memories, even when the people who made them are long gone." There was something in his voice, a quality that Weston couldn't quite identify, that made him look more closely at the photograph. The boy in the picture had light hair and a stubborn set to his jaw that reminded Weston of his own childhood portraits. The man beside him stood with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own skin, and his eyes held a kindness that seemed to reach across the decades. "Do you know anything about the history of this place?" Weston asked Samuel. "You mentioned last night that you were interested in old boundary maps." Samuel exchanged a quick glance with Ruth before answering. "We've traveled through this area before, years ago. Sometimes I like to see how places have changed, how families have built on what came before." It wasn't really an answer, and they all knew it, but something in Samuel's tone suggested that pressing for more information wouldn't be welcome. Instead, Weston found himself studying the photograph again, trying to understand why it affected him so strongly. "The boy looks a little like you did at that age," Martha observed, peering over his shoulder. "Same stubborn expression you get when you're thinking too hard about something." Ruth smiled at that. Children often carry the best features of their families forward, even when they don't realize it. Sometimes you can see 3 generations in a single face. Later that afternoon, Jake appeared at the back door, stamping snow from his boots and carrying news from the outside world. The main roads had been cleared, and communication had been restored to most of the county. More importantly, he'd been in touch with several neighbors, checking on their welfare and the condition of their livestock. "Strangest thing," Jake said as he settled into his usual chair at the kitchen table. "I talked to Bill Peterson over at the Triple Creek, and he mentioned that an elderly couple had stopped by his place about a week ago. Asked a lot of questions about local families, particularly the Coles. Said they were doing some kind of genealogy research." Weston felt his coffee cup grow cold in his hands. "What kind of questions?" "According to Bill, they wanted to know about the original Cole homestead, when the family first settled here. What happened to the descendants? Bill told them he thought the last of the Coles had died out years ago, but they seemed to think there might be someone still in the area." "That's odd," Martha said, but her eyes were fixed on Samuel and Ruth, who had gone very still at Jake's words. "Gets odder," Jake continued. "Tom Bradley at the Feed and Grain said a couple matching their description came by his place too, asking about employment records from the 1942nd. Seemed particularly interested in anyone named Cole who might have worked in the area." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, Samuel set down his coffee cup with deliberate care and looked directly at Weston. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice steady but somehow weighted with significance. "There's something Ruth and I need to tell you. Something about why we're really here." Samuel rose from his chair with the careful movements of a man whose bones remembered every hard winter they'd endured. He walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape for a long moment before turning back to face the room. Ruth remained seated, but Weston could see her hands clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. "Before I tell you anything else," Samuel said, "I need you to understand that Ruth and I didn't come here by accident. We've been traveling for a long time, looking for something, or rather, Someone. Martha set down her coffee cup with enough force to make it rattle against the saucer. "I knew it," she muttered. "Nobody gets that lost in a blizzard by coincidence." "What Martha means," Jake said more diplomatically, "is that we'd appreciate some straight answers. Who are you really, and what do you want with Weston?" Samuel nodded as if he'd expected the question. He reached into his ever-present bag and withdrew a bundle of papers tied with a faded ribbon. Even from across the room, Weston could see they were letters, their edges yellowed with age and their surfaces worn soft from handling. "These," Samuel said, holding up the bundle, "are letters. 43 of them, to be exact, written over the course of 28 years. Each one is a thank you note from a family we've helped. People who found themselves in difficult circumstances with nowhere else to turn." He untied the ribbon with gentle fingers and selected one letter from the middle of the stack. "This one is from the Hendersons in Wyoming. Their youngest son had pneumonia and they didn't have money for a doctor. We helped them get the medicine he needed and stayed until he was well enough to be out of danger." Ruth spoke for the first time since Samuel had begun his revelation. "Tommy Henderson is 34 years old now, married with children of his own. He sends us a Christmas card every year." Samuel selected another letter. "The Williamses in Colorado. House fire left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs. We helped them rebuild, and their oldest daughter just graduated from college, the first in her family to do so." "You're telling us you've been traveling around the country for nearly 30 years, helping strangers?" Weston asked. The idea was so foreign to his own way of thinking that he couldn't quite wrap his mind around it. "Not strangers," Ruth corrected gently. "People. Families who needed help and had no one else to turn to. Sometimes it was money, sometimes just labor, sometimes nothing more than someone willing to listen and offer advice." "But why?" Martha asked the question that was in all their minds. What drives two people to give up their own lives to help others? Samuel and Ruth exchanged one of their wordless communications, and Weston saw something pass between them, a shared grief so deep it had become part of who they were. "We had children once," Samuel said simply. "A son and a daughter. They died in an accident when they were still young. After that, helping other people's children, other families, it became our way of honoring their memory." The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of snow sliding from the roof. Weston felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of loss that called to his own buried grief. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "That must have been—" "It was a long time ago," Ruth interrupted, though her voice carried the weight of decades. "Grief either destroys you or it teaches you to find meaning in helping others bear their own burdens. We chose the latter." Jake leaned forward in his chair. "That still doesn't explain why you're here specifically, asking questions about the Cole family." Samuel returned to his chair, moving more slowly than before, as if the telling had aged him. 3 months ago, we received a letter. Not a thank you note this time, but a request for help. It was from a lawyer in Billings, handling the estate of a woman named Ellen Morrison. "Morrison," Jake repeated, and Weston saw recognition flicker in his foreman's eyes. "She was 91 when she died," Samuel continued, "and according to the lawyer, she'd been trying for years to locate someone. She'd heard about our work through friends of friends, the way these things spread, and she left instructions that if anything happened to her, we should be contacted." Ruth picked up the story. Ellen Morrison spent the last 15 years of her life looking for a boy she'd known as a child. A boy whose family had been broken apart by tragedy, who'd been placed with relatives and then lost track of completely. She never stopped believing he was out there somewhere, and she never stopped feeling responsible for what happened to him. Weston's coffee had gone cold, but he didn't notice. Something was building in his chest, a pressure that felt like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks. "The boy's name was Weston," Samuel said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper. "Weston Cole. And Ellen Morrison hoped that he'd grown up to become a successful rancher in Larkspur County, Montana. The room seemed to spin around Weston. Ellen Morrison. He hadn't heard that name in 40 years, but suddenly he was 8 years old. Again, standing in a farmhouse kitchen while adults argued in hushed voices about what to do with him after his parents died. Ellen had been the neighbor woman who'd taken care of him for 3 weeks while the relatives decided who would take responsibility for raising him. Ellen Morrison died, he asked, his voice hoarse. Last September, Ruth confirmed. But before she passed, she made sure her lawyer had enough information to help us find you. Property records, old school enrollment papers, even a copy of your parents' death certificates. She kept track of you as best she could over the years. Samuel reached into his bag once more and withdrew a sealed envelope, cream-colored and heavy. Weston's name was written across the front, in a shaky but determined hand. She left this for you, Samuel said, extending the envelope, along with instructions that we were to make sure you received it personally, and that we were to answer any questions you might have about your family's history. Weston stared at the envelope as if it might bite him. His hands shook slightly as he took it, feeling the weight of 40 years of silence and secrets pressing down on him. There's something else, Ruth said gently. Something Ellen wanted you to know about why your family's story ended the way it did, about what really happened, the winter your parents died, and why you were sent away. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up again, rattling the windows with a sound like distant voices calling across time. Weston held Ellen Morrison's letter for nearly an hour before opening it, turning the envelope over and over in his hands, while Samuel and Ruth waited with the patience of people who understood that some truths couldn't be rushed. Martha had retreated to the kitchen, claiming dinner preparations, but Weston could hear her moving around more than necessary, the sound of someone giving busy work to anxious hands. Jake had stayed, settling deeper into his chair with the stubborn loyalty of a man who wouldn't abandon his friend to face difficult news alone. When Weston finally broke the seal, his fingers trembled slightly. The letter was written on good paper, in the careful script of someone who'd grown up when penmanship mattered. Despite Ellen's advanced age, her handwriting remained clear and strong, each word formed with deliberate care. Dear Weston. He read aloud, his voice catching slightly on the familiar name, written in an unfamiliar hand. If you're reading this, then Samuel and Ruth have found you, and I have finally gone to join your parents and my dear husband in whatever comes after this life. I pray you will forgive an old woman for meddling in affairs that might be better left buried, but I have carried the weight of silence for 40 years, and I cannot take these secrets to my grave. He paused, looking up to find Samuel watching him with eyes that held deep compassion. She really kept track of me all these years, as best she could, Ruth replied. She subscribed to the local newspapers from 3 counties, looking for any mention of your name. When you started building your ranch into something significant, she followed your success like a proud grandmother. Weston returned to the letter. Your parents, Thomas and Mary Cole, died in the winter of 1975, but not the way you were told. The story about the car accident on icy roads, that was what we told you because you were only 8 years old, and we thought it would be easier than the truth. But you're a man now, and you deserve to know what really happened to your family. The paper rustled in Weston's hands as they tightened involuntarily. Jake leaned forward, his weathered face creased with concern, while Samuel reached into his bag once more. This time, he withdrew something Weston hadn't seen before, a walking stick made of dark wood, worn smooth by years of handling. Along its length, small holes had been drilled and fitted with tiny wooden plugs, creating a pattern that looked almost decorative until you examined it closely. Your father made that, Samuel said quietly, setting the walking stick where Weston could see it. He was always good with his hands, always making things for people who needed them. Weston stared at the walking stick, then back at the letter, pieces of a puzzle beginning to form a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see. How do you know what my father made? Instead of answering directly, Samuel reached for one of the wooden plugs and twisted it gently. It came free, revealing a small hollow space beneath. Inside, barely visible, was something that gleamed dully in the firelight. "He called them memory holes," Samuel explained. "Each one holds a token from a family he helped, people who needed assistance and had nowhere else to turn. Your father believed that kindness should be remembered, that the good we do for others creates a kind of immortality." Ruth spoke up from her chair. "He helped build barns for families whose crops had failed, delivered medicine to children when their parents couldn't afford doctors, even taught reading to adults who'd never had the chance to learn. Your parents spent their lives making other people's lives better." "But that's not why they died," Weston said, returning to the letter with a growing sense of dread. Ellen's words continued. "Your parents were killed because they witnessed something they shouldn't have seen. There were men in those days who used the remote mountain roads for business that couldn't stand the light of day. Your father happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he saw things that made him a danger to dangerous people." The room was completely silent now, except for the fire and Weston's slightly unsteady breathing. Martha had stopped moving around in the kitchen, and he suspected she was standing just out of sight, listening to every word. "He tried to do the right thing," the letter continued. "He went to the sheriff, told him what he'd seen, offered to testify about the illegal activities he'd witnessed. But some of the men involved had connections, money, influence. They couldn't afford to have your father's testimony heard in court." Weston's hands were shaking openly now. "They were murdered. The official report listed it as an accident," Samuel said, his voice heavy with old anger. "Car went off the road in a snowstorm," they said. "No witnesses, no evidence of foul play. Just a tragic accident that left a young boy orphaned." "But Ellen Morrison knew different," Ruth added. "She was your mother's closest friend, and your mother had confided in her about your father's concerns. Ellen knew he was frightened, that he'd been receiving threats." Jake's voice was rough when he spoke. "Why didn't she go to the authorities?" "She tried," Samuel replied. "But the same men who'd silenced your parents made it clear that anyone who asked too many questions would meet the same fate. Ellen was a widow, with her own young children to protect. She did the only thing she could. She made sure you were placed with relatives far away from here, where you'd be safe." Weston looked up from the letter, his vision blurry with unshed tears. "She saved my life, and carried the guilt of not being able to save your parents for the rest of hers," Ruth confirmed. Samuel twisted another plug from his walking stick, revealing another small treasure, a child's toy soldier, painted blue. "This belonged to you," he said simply. "Your father put it in the stick the day before they died. He was planning to give it to you for your 9th birthday." The toy soldier looked impossibly small in Samuel's weathered palm, but to Weston it represented everything he'd lost and forgotten. He reached out with one finger to touch the tiny figure, and suddenly he was 8 years old again, playing in the yard while his father worked on some project in the barn, his mother's voice calling him in for supper. "There's more," Samuel said gently. "The men who killed your parents, they're all dead now, died years ago, of natural causes. But the money they were moving, the business they were protecting, some of that money eventually found its way into legitimate investments, land purchases, development projects." "What are you telling me?" Weston asked, though part of him already knew. "Part of your ranch, Weston. Part of the Double Diamond sits on land that was bought with blood money. Ellen spent years tracing the financial connections, and she wanted you to know the truth about how some of your success was built on your family's tragedy." The walking stick fell from Samuel's hands, clattering to the floor and scattering its hidden treasures across the Persian rug. Tokens of kindness and memory lay scattered in the firelight like fallen stars, each one representing a life touched, a family helped, a moment when someone had chosen to do good in a world that often rewarded the opposite. Weston stared at them, understanding finally why Samuel and Ruth had come, why Ellen Morrison had sent them. It wasn't just about delivering a letter or revealing the truth about his parents' death. It was about completing a circle, honoring a legacy of kindness that had been interrupted by violence but never truly ended. She wanted me to carry it forward, he said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. She wanted you to know who you really are, Ruth corrected gently. Thomas and Mary Cole's son. A man whose parents believed that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't used to help others, and who died protecting that belief. Ruth had been quietly working on something while Samuel told his story, her fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent decades perfecting a particular skill. Now she held up what she'd been creating, a square of fabric no larger than her palm, pieced together from scraps that seemed to have been chosen for their significance rather than their beauty. "This is for you," she said, extending the square toward Weston. "It's meant to be part of something larger, but it can stand alone, if necessary." Weston took the fabric square, surprised by its weight. Up close, he could see that it wasn't randomly assembled scraps, but carefully chosen pieces. A fragment of blue denim that looked like it might have come from work clothes, a piece of red flannel soft with age, a small section of what appeared to be a child's yellow dress, faded but still cheerful. Each piece had been sewn to the others with tiny, perfect stitches that spoke of hours of patient work. "What is it?" he asked. "Part of a quilt," Ruth replied. "I've been working on it for 28 years, adding a square for each family we've helped. Each piece of fabric comes from something that belonged to them, a work shirt they didn't need anymore, a dress their daughter outgrew, a baby blanket that could be spared. With their permission, of course." She reached into her own bag and withdrew a larger section of fabric, revealing perhaps 30 squares already sewn together in a complex pattern that somehow made sense of what should have been chaos. Each square told a story in cloth and color, and together they formed something beautiful and meaningful in a way that expensive artwork never could. "This square," Ruth said, pointing to one near the center made from pieces of green work clothes and a child's red mittens. "That's from the Henderson family I mentioned earlier. Tommy's pneumonia. His mother gave me a piece of his father's work shirt and one of Tommy's mittens after he recovered." She moved her finger to another square, this one dominated by blue cotton and white lace. "The Williamses in Colorado, after their house fire. The lace came from Mrs. Williams' wedding dress, one of the few things that survived the fire. She said she wanted something beautiful to come from something so terrible." Weston studied the square Ruth had made for him, trying to understand its significance. The blue denim was easy enough, probably from his own work clothes that Martha had laundered. But the red flannel looked older, more worn, and the yellow fabric had a quality that suggested it had been precious to someone once. "Where did these pieces come from?" he asked. Ruth's smile was gentle but tinged with sadness. "The yellow is from a dress your mother made for herself the summer before she died. Ellen Morrison saved it all these years, hoping someday she'd have a chance to give it to you. The red flannel that was from a shirt your father wore when he was helping build the original foundation of this house." "How do you—" Weston began, then stopped. He was beginning to understand that Samuel and Ruth knew more about his family's history than he did himself. Samuel had been gathering the scattered tokens from his walking stick, handling each one with the reverence of someone touching sacred objects. Now he held up a small piece of carved bone shaped like a horse. "This came from a family in Nebraska," he said. "Father broke his leg in a farming accident, couldn't work for 3 months. Your father, your real father, Thomas, heard about their situation and drove 800 miles to help with their harvest. Wouldn't take payment, just asked them to help someone else when they could. The boy of the family carved this horse for Thomas from a piece of bone his grandfather had given him," Ruth added. "It was the most precious thing he owned, and he wanted your father to have it as thanks." Jake had been listening to all of this with the expression of a man watching his understanding of the world shift beneath his feet. Now he spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. "My grandfather used to tell stories about a man who showed up one winter when my family was about to lose their farm. Man who helped them restructure their debt, taught my grandfather better ways to manage the land, even helped build a new barn when the old one collapsed. Never would give his full name, just said to call him Tom. Samuel and Ruth exchanged one of their meaningful glances, and Weston saw confirmation in their eyes before Samuel spoke. "Your grandfather was Benjamin Morrison," Samuel said to Jake, "Ellen's husband. That's how she first learned about our work. Jake's grandfather wrote to thank us, and Ellen recognized the description of the man who'd helped him." Jake sat back in his chair as if he'd been struck. It means, Weston said slowly, the connections finally becoming clear, that Ellen Morrison kept track of me through you. She knew I'd be safe, as long as I was working with people connected to the families my parents helped. "She was protecting you in the only way she could," Ruth confirmed. "By making sure you were surrounded by good people, people who understood the value of the work your parents had done." Martha appeared in the doorway, her face flushed from cooking, and her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I heard most of that," she admitted without apology, "and I need to tell you all something." She entered the room fully, wiping her hands on her apron with nervous energy. "My maiden name was Henley, but before I married, it was Morrison. Ellen Morrison was my aunt." The silence that followed was complete, except for the crackling of the fire. Then Martha continued, her voice steady despite her obvious emotion. "She asked me to come work for you 15 years ago, said she'd heard you were a good man who needed looking after, and that I'd find the work rewarding. She never told me why it was important, just that it was. Now I understand." Weston looked around the room at these people who'd been placed in his life like pieces of a puzzle he'd never known he was solving. Jake, whose family had been helped by Weston's father. Martha, whose aunt had orchestrated his protection. Samuel and Ruth, who carried forward the mission of kindness that Thomas and Mary Cole had died defending. "She turned me into my parents' son without me even knowing it," he said, wonder and grief mixing in his voice. "Everything I built here, everyone who helped me build it, it was all part of her plan to keep their legacy alive." Ruth nodded, her hands returning to her quilting with automatic grace. "Ellen believed that kindness creates its own inheritance, that the good we do for others echoes forward through generations. She wanted to make sure that echo reached you." Samuel began fitting the tokens back into their hiding places in his walking stick, each one returning to its designated memory hole with practiced ease. "The question now," he said quietly, "is what you want to do with that inheritance. The money that came from your parents' deaths, you could give it away, use it to help others, continue the work they started, or you could simply know the truth and carry on as you have been. That's not really a choice, is it?" Weston asked, though he was smiling for the first time since this conversation began. "Not after everything you've told me." Ruth looked up from her quilting, and in her eyes Weston saw approval and something that might have been relief. "No," she said gently. "I don't suppose it is." The night passed slowly, filled with whispered conversations and the quiet rustle of memories being shared. Weston found himself unable to sleep, his mind churning through decades of realization and the weight of decisions that suddenly seemed far larger than his own life. He stood at his bedroom window, watching the snow catch moonlight like scattered diamonds, when he heard the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway. Samuel appeared at his door, still dressed despite the late hour, carrying something Weston hadn't seen before, a small wooden box, dark with age and worn smooth by countless hands. "Couldn't sleep either?" the old man asked. "Too much to think about," Weston replied. "Too many questions I'm not sure I want the answers to." Samuel nodded and entered the room without invitation, settling into the chair by the window with the careful movements of someone whose bones protested against the cold. He set the wooden box on the small table beside him, but didn't open it immediately. "There's something else," Samuel said quietly. "Something Ruth and I have been debating whether to tell you. Ellen's letter contained instructions about this too, but she left the decision to our judgment. Weston turned from the window, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the glass. What kind of something else? Instead of answering directly, Samuel opened the wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet that might once have been blue, was a birth certificate. Even from across the room, Weston could see it was old, the paper yellowed and fragile, the official seals faded but still visible. Samuel James Cole, Samuel read from the certificate. Born March 15th, 1935, in Larkspur County, Montana. Parents listed as James Robert Cole and Margaret Ann Cole, née Williams. Weston felt the blood drain from his face. "That's my birth certificate," Samuel finished quietly. "I haven't used it in 40 years, not since the night my son and daughter-in-law were murdered." The room seemed to tilt around Weston. He gripped the windowsill for support as the impossible truth settled over him like a weight he couldn't bear. "You're my grandfather," he whispered. "I am." Samuel's voice was steady, but Weston could see his hands trembling as he held the certificate. "Thomas Cole was my son, your father, the man who died trying to do the right thing, trying to live up to the values I thought I'd taught him. But you're supposed to be dead," Weston said, his voice rising with confusion and something that might have been anger. "Everyone told me my grandfather died before I was born." Samuel set the birth certificate carefully back in its box. "In a way, I did die that night. The man I was before Samuel Cole, respected member of the community, proud father and grandfather, he died when I learned what my past had cost my family." "What do you mean, your past?" Samuel was quiet for so long that Weston thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of guilt and regret. "I wasn't always a man who helped people, Weston. During the war, World War II, I did things, saw things, became someone I'm not proud of. After I came home, I tried to put that behind me, to build a normal life with your grandmother. We had your father, raised him to be a good man, a man who believed in doing right by others." He paused, reaching into the wooden box again and withdrawing something else, a military medal, tarnished with age but still recognizable as a bronze star. "But the war follows you," Samuel continued. "The men you served, with the connections you made, the debts you owed and were owed. I thought I'd left all that behind, but 20 years later, some of those old connections came looking for favors. They wanted to use the mountain roads around here for smuggling, and they needed local cooperation to make it work. And you said no," Weston said, though even as he spoke, he had a sinking feeling that wasn't the whole truth. "I said yes," Samuel admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "At first, they made it clear that refusing wasn't an option, that my family would suffer if I didn't cooperate. So I looked the other way, let them use roads that crossed my property, pretended I didn't know what was happening." The medal caught the lamplight as Samuel turned it over in his hands. "But Thomas found out. My son, who I'd raised to believe in honesty and justice, discovered that his father was helping criminals. We had terrible arguments about it, fights that said things we could never take back. He threatened to go to the authorities himself if I didn't put a stop to it." "So you did," Weston said, hope creeping into his voice. "I tried to," Samuel replied. "I told them I was out, that they needed to find another way. But by then Thomas had already seen too much, knew too many details. They couldn't risk him talking, even if I convinced him to stay quiet. So they eliminated the threat." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Weston sank into the chair across from his grandfather, the full horror of the truth settling over him. "They killed my parents because of you," he said. "Yes." Samuel's voice was steady, but tears were running down his weathered cheeks. "They killed my son and my daughter-in-law because I was a coward who chose my own safety over doing what was right. And then they made it clear that if I ever spoke about what really happened, you would be next. So you disappeared. I became someone else, left everything behind, including you. I let people believe I was dead because it was easier than living with what I'd done. For 40 years, I've tried to make up for that choice by helping other families, by doing the good I should have done from the beginning. Ruth appeared in the doorway, moving silently in her stocking feet. He's been punishing himself for 4 decades, she said softly, trying to save enough families to balance the scales for the one family he couldn't save. But it doesn't balance, Samuel said, looking directly at Weston for the first time since beginning his confession. It never balances. Every good thing Ruth and I have done, every family we've helped, it doesn't bring back your parents or give you back the grandfather you should have had. Weston stared at this man, who was supposed to be his family, trying to reconcile the image of the helper and protector with the truth of the coward who'd caused his parents' deaths. Part of him wanted to rage, to throw Samuel out into the storm and never see to him again. But another part, the part that recognized his father's kindness and his mother's gentle strength in Samuel's weathered face, understood that this old man had been carrying a burden that would have crushed most people long. Ellen Morrison knew, he said finally. She knew you were alive, knew who you really were. She figured it out about 10 years ago, Ruth confirmed. Started putting together the stories about our work, the timeline of when we started helping people, the way Samuel talked about Thomas and Mary. She confronted us in a letter, demanded to know the truth. And she still sent you to me, Weston said. Knowing what you'd done, she still wanted you to find me. Samuel nodded, his hands steady again as he closed the wooden box. She said forgiveness wasn't hers to give, that it had to come from you if it came at all. But she thought, hoped, that maybe knowing the truth about everything might help you understand who your parents really were and who you could choose to become. She wanted us to give you a choice, Ruth added. The choice to have family again, even family that comes with this much pain and history, or the choice to send us away, knowing that you'd honored your parents' memory by listening to the truth. Outside, the wind had died completely, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to press against the windows. Weston looked at his grandfather, this stranger who carried his father's eyes and his mother's smile, and tried to understand what forgiveness might look like in a world where good and evil were so tangled together they couldn't be separated. "What happens now?" he asked. Samuel stood, moving toward the door with the careful dignity of a man who'd said everything he came to say. "Now you decide whether Samuel Cole gets to live again, or whether he stays dead and buried with the mistakes he made 40 years ago." He paused in the doorway, looking back one last time. "Either way, I want you to know your father would be proud of the man you became. He'd be proud of the kindness you've already shown to 2 strangers in a storm." With that, he was gone, leaving Weston alone with the weight of truth and the impossible mathematics of love, loss, and redemption. Dawn came grey and muted, filtered through clouds that promised more snow before nightfall. Weston hadn't slept at all, spending the remaining hours of darkness pacing his room and wrestling with emotions he couldn't name. Anger warred with longing, grief battled with hope, and underneath it all ran a current of something he'd thought was long dead, the simple, desperate desire for family. When he finally made his way downstairs, he found the house unusually quiet. Martha was in the kitchen, but her usual morning bustle was subdued, and she looked up at him with eyes that held sympathy and concern. On the counter beside the coffee pot sat something that hadn't been there the night before, a small wooden chest, dark, with age and secured with a simple brass clasp. "Samuel left that for you," Martha said quietly. "Said you should look at it when you were ready, but not before." Weston poured himself coffee and studied the chest without touching it. "Where are they?" "Out in the barn. Samuel's been up since before dawn, helping Jake with the morning chores. Ruth's with him, mending some old harness that didn't really need mending." Martha paused in her work, fixing him with the direct gaze that had made her such an effective housekeeper. "They're giving you space to think, but they're not running away. Whatever you decide, they'll face it. Through the kitchen window, Weston could see figures moving in the barn, their silhouettes dark against the snow-reflected light. Jake's solid form was easy to recognize, but beside him moved a taller, leaner figure that carried himself with a dignity that 4 decades of guilt hadn't been able to break. For just a moment, watching that silhouette, Weston could imagine his father at that age, moving with the same purposeful grace. "Martha," he said carefully, "what would you do? If you were in my position—" She set down the bowl she'd been washing and turned to face him fully. "That's not for me to say, Weston. But I will tell you this. I've watched you for 15 years, seen how you carry yourself through the world. You're a good man, but you're a lonely one. You've built walls around yourself so high that even kindness has trouble getting through. Maybe I had good reasons for those walls." "Maybe you did," she agreed. "But walls that keep out pain also keep out love. And family, real family, is messy and complicated, and sometimes it comes with more pain than you think you can bear. But it's still family." The wooden chest seemed to pulse with possibility and dread. Weston reached for it, then stopped, his fingers hovering over the brass clasp. "He's an old man," Martha continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Whatever he did 40 years ago, whatever mistakes he made, he's spent the rest of his life trying to make amends. That doesn't erase the past, but it might mean something for the future." Before Weston could respond, the kitchen door opened and Jake stamped in, bringing with him the scent of hay and animals and the sharp bite of winter air. He looked at Weston, then at the unopened chest, and nodded as if he'd expected to find exactly this scene. "He's waiting for you out there," Jake said without preamble. "Been waiting all morning, though he's too proud to say so. That old man's carrying a load of guilt that would have crushed most people years ago, but he's still standing, still trying to do right by folks." "You think I should forgive him?" Weston said. "It wasn't really a question. I think," Jake replied carefully, "that forgiveness isn't about him. It's about you, about whether you want to spend the rest of your life angry at a ghost or whether you want to have a grandfather while there's still time." Martha had returned to her work, but Weston could see her listening to every word. These people who'd become his makeshift family were watching him wrestle with the possibility of real family, and their quiet support felt both comforting and overwhelming. Finally, Weston opened the chest. Inside, wrapped in faded silk that might once have been white, lay a medal, unlike the bronze star Samuel had shown him the night before. This one was smaller, more personal, a purple heart, its ribbon worn soft with handling. Beneath it lay a photograph, black and white and creased from years of folding and unfolding. The image showed a young man in military uniform standing beside a woman in a simple dress, her hand resting on the arm of a small boy who looked perhaps 3 years old. At the bottom of the chest lay a single sheet of paper covered with writing in Samuel's careful script. Weston lifted it out, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. "My dear grandson," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then you know the truth about who I am and what I did. I won't insult your intelligence by making excuses or asking for forgiveness I haven't earned. But I want you to understand something about the man your father was and the legacy he left behind." The letter continued, describing Thomas Cole not as Samuel's idealized memory of a son, but as a complex man who'd struggled with his own demons and doubts. Thomas had grown up knowing his father was a war hero, but he'd also seen the nightmares that woke Samuel in the night, the way he sometimes stared at nothing for hours at a time, lost in memories of things that couldn't be shared. "Your father knew I was broken," Samuel had written, "but he never stopped believing I could be fixed. When I made the choice to help those criminals, he didn't just see it as betrayal of the law, he saw it as betrayal of everything he thought I could become. The fight we had wasn't just about right and wrong. It was about whether the man who raised him had been a lie all along." The words blurred as tears Weston hadn't realized he was shedding made reading difficult. He wiped his eyes and continued, "I failed your father, and I failed you, and I failed the memory of every good man who died in that war, believing they were fighting for something decent. But your parents' death wasn't the end of their story, Weston. You became the end of their story. Every act of kindness you've shown, every person you've helped, every moment when you chose to do right instead of easy, that's them living on through you." The letter concluded with an offer that took Weston's breath away. "Ruth and I have spent 28 years helping families because we couldn't help our own family when it mattered. We've saved enough money to fund a foundation, something permanent that could continue the work after we're gone. I'm offering to sign it all over to you, not as payment for my sins, because no amount of money could balance those scales, but as a way for Thomas and Mary Cole's son to honor their memory by helping others the way they would have helped others." Weston set down the letter and stared at the Purple Heart, trying to process the magnitude of what his grandfather was offering. Not just money, though there was clearly substantial money involved, but purpose, a way to transform 40 years of pain into something meaningful. "He's offering me his life's work," Weston said aloud. "Sounds like it," Jake agreed. "Question is, what are you going to do with it?" Through the window, Weston could see Samuel and Ruth standing in the barn doorway, not looking toward the house, but not moving away from it either. They were waiting, he realized, not pressuring, not demanding, just making themselves available for whatever decision he made. The Purple Heart felt heavy in his palm, weighted with decades of sacrifice and loss, and the strange mathematics of guilt and redemption. His father had died believing in the possibility that good men could overcome their mistakes, that broken things could be fixed with enough effort and love. His grandfather had spent 40 years testing that theory, and now the results were being offered to Weston like an inheritance he'd never expected. He thought about Ellen Morrison, orchestrating protection for him across decades because she believed family bonds were stronger than time or distance or even betrayal. He thought about Martha and Jake, drawn into his life by forces they didn't understand, but accepting their roles with grace and loyalty. He thought about Samuel and Ruth, carrying forward a mission of kindness that had begun with his parents' idealism and been tempered by his grandfather's guilt. Most of all, he thought about the choice before him, not just whether to forgive, but whether to step into a legacy that was both beautiful and terrible, whether to become the man his parents had died believing he could become. Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle at first, but with the promise of intensity to come. Soon, the roads would be impassable again, trapping them all together for another day or more. Time enough to make decisions that would change everything, or time enough to let the moment pass and return to the comfortable isolation he'd built around himself. Weston closed his fingers around the Purple Heart and made his choice. Weston found Samuel in the barn, sitting on a hay bale with Ruth beside him, both of them watching the snow fall through the open doors. Samuel held something in his hands, turning it over and over with the absent rhythm of nervous habit. As Weston approached, he could see it was a ring, a simple gold band, worn thin by decades of wear. "That was my mother's," Weston said, recognizing it even though he hadn't seen it since childhood. Samuel looked up, his blue eyes bright with unshed tears. "Your grandmother's before that, and her mother's before that. Mary was wearing it the night she died." His voice caught. "I took it off her finger at the funeral home because I couldn't bear the thought of it being buried with her. I've carried it every day since, waiting for the right moment to give it to you." The ring caught the grey light, filtering through the barn, its surface worn smooth by generations of women who'd loved and lost and endured. Weston could remember his mother wearing it, the way she'd twist it around her finger when she was thinking, the soft clicking sound it made when she drummed her fingers on the kitchen table. "I've been trying to find the courage to give this back to you for 40 years, Samuel continued. "But every time I thought about facing you, about explaining what I'd done, I lost my nerve. It was easier to help strangers than to face my own grandson. Ruth reached over and covered Samuel's weathered hands with her own. "He's here now," she said simply. Weston sat down across from them on another hay bale, close enough to see the deep lines of sorrow carved around his grandfather's eyes, close enough to smell the scent of soap and old wool that clung to his clothes. This close, the resemblance to his father was unmistakable, the set of his jaw, the way his hands moved when he spoke, even the particular shade of blue in his eyes. "I read your letter," Weston said. Samuel nodded. And I understand why you did what you did. I understand the fear, the pressure, the impossible choice you thought you were facing. I even understand why you disappeared afterward." Weston paused, watching snow swirl in the barn's entrance. "But understanding isn't the same as forgiving." "I know," Samuel said quietly. "My parents died because you were a coward," Weston continued, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I grew up without family, without anyone to tell me stories about where I came from or what my parents were really like. Because you chose to save your own skin instead of doing what was right." Each word seemed to hit Samuel like a physical blow, but he didn't flinch away from them. He sat straight, accepting the judgment he'd carried in his own heart for 4 decades. "But," Weston said, and the word hung in the air like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm, "you've spent 40 years trying to make up for that choice. You've helped hundreds of families, saved lives, made the world a little bit better, one person at a time. That doesn't balance the scales, nothing could, but it counts for something." Ruth was crying now, silent tears that tracked down her cheeks without changing her expression. Samuel's hands had gone completely still, the ring resting motionless in his palm. "I've been alone for most of my adult life," Weston continued. "I built this ranch, accumulated wealth, created something impressive and successful, but I did it all alone. I told myself I preferred it that way, that independence was strength, but the truth is, I've been afraid. Afraid of losing people I cared about, afraid of the pain that comes with loving someone." He reached out and took the ring from Samuel's palm, feeling its familiar weight, the places where it had been worn thin by decades of nervous handling. "This ring connects me to women I barely remember, to a history I thought was lost forever. And you," Weston looked directly into his grandfather's eyes, "you're the only connection I have left to my parents, to the people who made me who I am." Samuel's composure finally cracked. 40 years of held tears broke free, and his shoulders shook with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Ruth moved closer, wrapping her arms around him while he wept for his son and daughter-in-law, for the grandson he'd abandoned, for all the years lost to guilt and fear. "I'm sorry," Samuel said through his tears. "I'm so sorry, Weston. I know it's not enough, but I am so sorry." Weston stood and moved around the hay bale, kneeling in front of his grandfather like a child seeking a blessing. "It's not enough," he agreed, "but it's a beginning." For a moment they stayed like that, 3 generations of loss and love, and the fragile possibility of redemption. Then Weston reached out and took Samuel's weathered hands in his own. "I can't forgive you," he said. "Not yet. Maybe not ever completely. But I can choose to love you anyway. I can choose to be your grandson, and you can choose to be my grandfather, and we can see if that's enough to build something on." Samuel looked up, hope and disbelief warring in his eyes. "You mean it?" "I mean it," Weston said, slipping his mother's ring onto his own little finger where it fit perfectly. "Welcome home, Grandpa." Later that evening, as the family and Weston found, he could think of them that way, now gathered around the great room fireplace, Samuel reached into his bag one final time. He withdrew a leather document folder, thick with papers and sealed with red wax that bore an official-looking stamp. "There's one more thing," Samuel said, his voice still rough from the afternoon's emotional revelations. "Something I should have told you about much sooner." He broke the wax seal and spread the documents across the coffee table. Even upside down, Weston could see they were property deeds, legal papers dense with official language and signatures. Ruth moved closer, her hand resting on Samuel's shoulder as he sorted through the documents. 5 years ago, Samuel began, developers started circling your ranch like vultures. Word got out about the oil rights beneath your eastern pastures, the potential for mineral extraction, the value of this land for commercial development. They started making offers to your neighbors, buying up adjacent properties with the intention of eventually forcing you to sell. Jake leaned forward, his expression sharpening. I remember that. Weston turned down half a dozen offers, but they kept coming back with higher numbers. What? You didn't know. Samuel continued, pulling out a specific deed and turning it so Weston could read it. Is that someone else was buying land too? Not to develop it, but to protect it. Weston stared at the document in disbelief. It was a deed to the Morrison property, the 1,000-acre spread that bordered his northern fence line. But the name in the buyer's line wasn't a development company or investment group. It was Samuel James Cole. You bought the Morrison place? Weston asked. And the Henderson Ranch to the south, Ruth added quietly, and the 2 smaller properties that connect your land to the state forest. 7,000 acres in total, purchased over the past 5 years. Samuel spread out more deeds, creating a map in paper that showed the full extent of his purchases. Together, the properties formed a protective buffer around the Double Diamond, ensuring that no development could encroach on the ranch from any direction. I used the money Ruth and I saved over 28 years of helping families, Samuel explained. Every dollar we didn't spend on ourselves, every payment we refused to take for our work, it all went into protecting this land. Protecting what my son built, and what his son was building on top of it. Martha appeared from the kitchen carrying a tray of coffee, and her expression of someone who'd been listening to every word. That's why land prices stayed stable around here when everywhere else was going crazy, she said. You were competing with the developers, driving up the cost of acquisition until they moved on to easier targets. But why? Weston asked, though part of him already knew the answer. If you thought I'd never forgive you, if you believed you'd never be part of my life, why spend everything you had protecting my ranch? Samuel's hands were steady as he gathered the deeds back into a neat stack, because this land represents everything Thomas and Mary believed in. Honest work, taking care of the environment, building something lasting and good. I couldn't save them, but I could save what they would have wanted their son to create. Ruth reached into her own bag and withdrew the quilt she'd been working on for decades. In the firelight, the individual squares seemed to glow with their own inner warmth, each piece of fabric telling a story of kindness given and received. She spread it carefully across the coffee table, covering the deeds with something infinitely more precious than legal documents. We want you to have this too, she said. Not just our money or the land we bought, but the work itself, the mission, the families who still need help. There's a list, Samuel added, producing a small notebook filled with his careful handwriting. Names and addresses of people who've written to us, asking for assistance. Families facing eviction, medical bills they can't pay, children who need help getting to college. More requests than 2 old people can handle anymore. Weston looked at the quilt, at the deeds beneath it, at the notebook full of names representing desperate hope. The scope of what they were offering him was staggering, not just money or property, but purpose. A way to transform his wealth from something he'd accumulated for himself into something that could change lives. You're giving me everything, he said. We're giving you the chance to be who your parents raised you to be, Ruth corrected gently. The man Thomas and Mary Cole's son was always meant to become. Jake spoke up from his chair near the fire. It's not just about the money, is it? It's about having something bigger than yourself to work toward. Family legacy, Martha added, understanding dawning in her voice. Not just blood family, but chosen family. All the people you help become part of your family, part of your story. Samuel nodded, lifting the deed to the Morrison property and holding it out to Weston. The choice is yours, grandson. You can accept this inheritance, all of it, or you can send us on our way and continue living the life you've built for yourself. Either way, you'll know that everything we did because we love you and believe in the man you've become." Weston took the deed, feeling its weight as something far greater than mere paper and ink. With it came responsibility, obligation, and the chance to step into a legacy that stretched back generations and forward into a future he couldn't yet imagine. "I accept," he said simply, "all of it." Spring came early that year, arriving with a warmth that melted the snow faster than the ground could absorb it, turning the ranch roads into rivers of mud and filling the air with the sound of running water. From his office window, Weston watched Samuel teaching Jake's youngest grandson how to repair fence posts, the old man's patient instructions carrying across the yard on the April breeze. 3 months had passed since that night in the barn. 3 months of learning to be a family again. It hadn't been easy. 40 years of separation couldn't be bridged overnight, and there were still moments when grief and anger surfaced without warning. But they were building something together, slowly and carefully, like constructing a house on ground that had been broken before. The double diamond had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. The guest room where Samuel and Ruth had first stayed was now permanently theirs, filled with the accumulated treasures of their decades of travel. Ruth's quilting supplies occupied the corner by the window, where the morning light was best, and her completed masterpiece hung on the wall of the great room where everyone could see it, a visual testament to 28 years of kindness given and received. Samuel's walking stick rested in the umbrella stand by the front door, its hidden compartments now empty. The tokens of gratitude it had carried for so many years had been carefully catalogued and stored in a place of honor, but their work was done. The stick itself had been retired in favor of something new, a foundation that bore Thomas and Mary Cole's names and carried forward their belief that wealth meant nothing if it wasn't shared with those who needed it most. The first family they'd helped together, the Rodriguezes from the next county over, facing foreclosure on their small farm, had written a thank-you note that now sat framed on Weston's desk. The letter was simple, written in careful English by someone for whom the language didn't come naturally, but its gratitude was profound. Reading it each morning had become part of Weston's routine, a reminder of why the work mattered. Martha appeared in the doorway carrying a tray of coffee and wearing the expression of someone with news to share. Over the months, she'd stepped naturally into the role of foundation coordinator, managing correspondence with families who needed help and keeping track of the complex logistics involved in changing lives from a distance. "The Williamses wrote again," she said, setting down the tray and producing a thick envelope from her apron pocket. "Remember them from Ruth's quilt? The house fire in Colorado? Their daughter just graduated from medical school, and she wants to volunteer for us this summer, helping families with medical issues they can't afford to address." Weston accepted the letter, noting how the return address had been written in the same careful script as the original thank-you note Ruth had shown him months earlier. The continuity pleased him, evidence that kindness really did create its own inheritance, passed down through generations like the ring he now wore on his little finger. "There's something else," Martha continued, settling into her usual chair with the satisfaction of someone who'd saved the best news for last. "That lawyer from Billings called. Ellen Morrison's estate has been fully settled, and there was one final bequest we didn't know about. She produced another document, this one bearing official seals and the kind of legal language that suggested significant financial implications." Weston scanned it quickly, his eyes widening as he understood what he was reading. "She left money for a scholarship fund," he said. "A substantial scholarship fund," Martha corrected. "Enough to send 30 students a year to college, with preference given to children from families our foundation has helped. She'd been planning it for years, apparently, just waiting for the right time to make it official." Through the window, Weston could see Ruth hanging laundry on the line that stretched between the house and the barn. At 70-something, she insisted on doing her own washing, claiming that the work kept her hands strong for quilting. Samuel appeared beside her, taking one end of a heavy blanket and helping her secure it against the spring wind. They moved together with the unconscious coordination of people who'd learned to anticipate each other's needs, their voices too distant to hear, but their laughter carrying clearly across the yard. Jake's grandson had abandoned fence repair in favor of chasing the barn cat, his delighted shrieks adding to the symphony of a ranch coming alive after winter's silence. It was a sound Weston had never heard before, the sound of his land being used by children, by family, by people who belonged there, not because they worked there, but because they were loved there. A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Martha went to answer it, returning a few minutes later with a young woman who looked nervous but determined, clutching a worn envelope in hands that shook slightly. "This is Maria Santos," Martha said gently. "She drove up from Billings. Her family needs help." Weston rose from his chair, noting the careful way Maria held herself, the pride that wore with desperation in her eyes. He'd learned to recognize the look over the past 3 months, people who'd exhausted every other option but weren't yet ready to admit defeat. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Tell me how we can help." As Maria began her story, medical bills, lost jobs, children who needed things their parents couldn't provide, Weston found himself thinking about the circle that had brought them all to this moment. His parents' idealism, interrupted by violence but never truly broken. His grandfather's guilt, transformed over decades into purpose. Ellen Morrison's quiet protection, extending beyond death to ensure the work continued. Ruth's quilted record of lives touched and changed, each square a reminder that kindness created its own legacy. Outside, Samuel was teaching Jake's grandson how to whistle through grass blades, their attempts producing more laughter than music. The sound drifted through the open window, mixing with Maria's careful words and Martha's gentle questions, creating something that felt like what Weston imagined home was supposed to sound like. When Maria finished her story, Weston reached for his checkbook but stopped. Instead, he opened the desk drawer and withdrew a square of fabric deep blue denim, soft with age, that Ruth had cut from one of his own work shirts. "We'll help your family," he told Maria. "But first, I'd like you to meet my grandmother. She's going to want to hear your story too, and she'll probably ask for something small that belonged to one of your children. Something we can remember them by." Through the window, the spring wind carried the sound of his grandfather's laughter, his grandmother's gentle voice, and the promise that some gifts truly could be wrapped in the most unexpected packages.